So we'll start this bit on how diseases have evolved over human societal periods with another Gahan or Gahan Wilson cartoon. And the caption is, "Please don't be alarmed, Mr. Parker, but those preliminary tests indicate the advisability of a few precautions." So everything's fine. We're just being careful. Not a bad idea. I'd kind of like to know what the tests were, but turned out pretty bad, apparently. So the step-by-step evolution of childhood diseases. Now, childhood disease in this context are diseases that classically have spread amongst children and have affected them, but nowhere near as badly as if they got into an adult who had never been exposed as a child. Measles, nasty disease, perfectly capable of killing a kid, but doesn't that often. If you're an adult who's never had the measles or never been vaccinated, or your vaccine has waned, which they discovered a few years ago was a thing, then measles in an adult can be much more bizarre and much more dangerous. And the same thing's true for mumps. It's true for rubella. There's a bunch of diseases that are considered, and classically have been considered childhood diseases. Even something like chickenpox. And the thing was, when I was a kid, these were the diseases the kids got. And the reason that I don't need a chickenpox vaccination is I got chickenpox when I was a kid. I don't know that I got measles. I got German rubella when I was a kid. Turns out I have antibodies for the mumps and never even knew that I was exposed to the mumps as a kid. Well, actually, I knew I was exposed. My sister had it, but I never had the symptoms because children don't tend to get these things as nastily as adults do. Well, how the heck does that happen? Well, it goes step by step classically. And it requires a society with a bunch of cities. So once it was pretty well, Europe was pretty well established. Europe became a place where these kinds of diseases could cook. China became an area where these diseases could cook. For a while, Mesoamerica, the Mayan civilizations, the Aztec civilizations became a place where these sorts of things could cook up. The Europeans were somewhat lucky that there really wasn't anything. The Mesoamerican civilizations were kind of on the downturn, and actually probably were fighting a new wave disease when the Spanish came through, and there's some question as to whether what really knocked the Mesoamerican civilizations down. There were diseases, whether it was something the Europeans brought or something that they were already dealing with that didn't easily come back with the Europeans because of the way that it spread. Something they later started to call Four Corners disease. Anyway, humans come into contact with a lot of organisms that produce, or sometimes don't even produce diseases in other animals. They may be very good at living in the other animals, so you barely even know that the animals are sick, and they barely know that they're sick. And most of the time, their offspring, even if they get into a human, they can't really set up shop there. They're not really, we covered this in the last video, they can't access all the requirements that they have to really live there, and if they do live there, they don't effectively spread to other people. A few years ago, flus do this all the time. Influenza is actually very good at coming up with variants that can jump into different animals. And they're pretty good at coming up with variants that can then jump into other animals of the same type. Bird flu of a few years ago, not that good. It could get into people who were exposed by the flu in birds, but there was only 1 or 2 cases where it looked pretty clearly that a variant had jumped from one person to another. And even then, didn't seem to be that great at it. And so there was like a village in Malaysia where it happened, and it kind of just petered out there. But the fear was that the bird flu was going to become a human-to-human contact disease, and it never did. But they do. Influenza cooks in pigs, comes back into people. Cooks in birds, comes back into people. Cooks in horses occasionally and comes back to people. But it's unusual. It doesn't happen that often. For all the different variants of disease organisms that live in other animals, their ability to infect and spread in people is rare. But we got people out there in the woods, killing animals all the time. Is that it looks like COVID originated in some sort of wild animal. Is that the genetics says that it was classically a bat disease organism and spread to something maybe like pangolins, which are oddball little animals that there's a trade for. And then a variant in the pangolins became capable of infecting and spreading in people. But all of your classic diseases started out this way. Now the thing is, Ebola for a long time was an isolated disease of African villages and did some fairly nasty things in some fairly isolated parts of Africa. It really became, and it was feared, what's going to happen if somebody carries this into one of our major cities? And that was the big deal when Ebola struck 10, 12 years ago, something like that, is it got carried into some of the major African cities where it could spread amongst a big population. And the village outbreaks showed an incredibly high mortality rate. Is it something in the realm of 95%? Is that some of the city-borne outbreaks were dropping down into around 50% mortality rate. What's going on? Two things. Coevolution is that who's more likely to sustain and spread a new disease? People that can resist the effects, that are not really affected that strongly by it, and can stay up and healthy for at least for a longer period of time. Something about their internal chemistry can deal with the presence of these disease organisms, as opposed to the people that are knocked down pretty quickly or are killed pretty quickly. So resistant population. A lot of that resistance is stuff that is part of their genetic code, and they can now have babies with other people that survived the outbreak, and whatever variants of resistance they can spread to their kids. And you do eventually produce a population that is more resistant to the disease. The hosts are more resistant to the disease. But in the meantime, in this population, the variants of the disease that are less likely to really knock down the hosts or kill the hosts, they also have an advantage because they can spread further. If their hosts are up and contagious for a longer period of time, then those variants are more likely to spread among the population. So diseases in these city populations, kills a bunch of people, survivors are resistant. Kills a bunch of people, the variants that are in a lot of those dead people don't get a chance to spread, the milder variants do get a chance to spread. So over time, this first wave of diseases is pretty nasty in that first outbreak and a little bit less nasty as time goes on. But the disease organisms typically are on a clock. They can't live in their hosts indefinitely because eventually the hosts, even the resistant ones, will develop antibodies. And the antibodies are a much more effective way of clearing the disease organisms from the host entirely. So no more disease organisms, no more offspring, no more spread. The survivors develop immunity. That means that in any isolated population, the disease is going to run out of hosts, and it'll be cleared out of the hosts that it has. That'll be the end of it. For a long time, that's what was true with Ebola. It was going through these villages and killing them all, and not spreading to other villages because the villages were too isolated. Once it got into a city, you saw, I mean, it becomes different when there's medical interventions, and we as people who understand disease organisms start to isolate people and treat in certain ways. In the case of Ebola, they vaccinate, several layers of contacts to people that are Ebola positive to try to keep it from spreading beyond like this realm of contagion. So we break some of these patterns with modern interventions, but this is the classic way that this worked. This is why you need a network of cities. In order for the organism to persist, they need to find a new population of potential hosts. And so you need a city close by enough that people carrying the disease organism can get there. On foot, that's a little tricky. So you don't tend to see these patterns develop until horse-drawn carts and such are spread. Maybe that's a reason why the Mesoamericas were not as prone to this, because they didn't have wheels and roads and stuff. So, because you got to get a sick person, or at least a carrier, to the next city to start a new wave of infection there. There's a very good chance they're carrying a milder version of the disease, but now you've got a whole population that is disease naive. So there's going to be a bunch of them even there that are not compatible with this new wave of disease. So again, you may not wipe out quite as many of them, but you're still going to have this wave of they don't get along, bad stuff happens. And then you need another city, and another city, and another city. This is why you need a network of cities. Now, if this starts in city A and spreads to city B, is that sick people coming back to city A, the survivors are immune. There's not really any way to set up shop there again until there's a big enough population of potential hosts in city A for the disease to come back around. You need a population of potential hosts. You need enough people that you can make them sick and spread. Well, after a few years, you've got a new population of potential hosts, the children. We can pass our resistances on to our children, but we cannot pass our immunities on to our children. So our children may be less likely to get sick from this disease, but it is a little tricky because children are a different type of ecosystem for the disease organisms. They're chemically different than adults. And so you go through another wave of adaptation. So now the disease variants that are successful, that can spread amongst the population, are the ones that don't produce huge nastiness in children, because that's their new population. Now, they may not be as good eventually at living in adults. Not a big deal. The adults are not a big part of their potential population anyway. They just keep popping around place to place and coming back when there's enough children to support them. And so now we have a disease that classically was just an across-the-board disease that has become a specialist childhood disease. For COVID, once we get a broad enough, we get a vaccine that works fairly well. If we get a broad enough application of the vaccine, at some point somebody's going to need to decide, is this something that we're going to need to give kids to keep this from being a big deal? And that's going to be tricky because this is already very mild in children. And so protecting the adults are going to be vaccinated, so do we need to protect them from the children, or do we just let it play out in the children? This is always a question for vaccinating children. Measles is a fairly nasty disease, kills a decent number of kids in a world without no measles vaccines. So vaccinating for measles was easy. Vaccinating for rubella, which is not quite as nasty, was a little bit more of a decision. Vaccinating for every disease you vaccinate for, you have to decide cost and benefit, and there are costs involved. Is it nasty enough to require this? And for the most part, the diseases that we vaccinate our kids for are dangerous enough that the answer has been yes. For COVID, we're going to have to decide that at some point if we have an effective broad-scale vaccine. But this is how you get a disease in nature that's a childhood disease. This is also how you get a disease that can be picked up in an exploratory sailboat, sailing ship, and travel to another part of the world. During the age of exploration, people got on the boats with whatever European diseases they were carrying, and I'm sure it spread through the boat, and some people got really sick, but a lot of people, because they were in a resistant population, their ancestors had kind of adapted to it, is that they were able to weather it and get through, but when they got to the new place and coughed on the new natives, here was another naive population, a population that had never been exposed to the disease, was genetically a little bit different from the Europeans that it came from. One thing nobody's really looking at, but I am starting to hear about how COVID seems to be milder in some populations of the world than in others. And nobody's really looking at genetic resistance, or populations that already, for one reason or another, maybe they make interferon quicker, or they do, who knows. But they may, by nature, be more resistant to this particular disease. But for the most part, the world is a naive population, and COVID's just spreading kind of through it. Okay, so that's how new diseases evolve. For people in my classes, the next section is going to be, we're going to break down the different classes of disease organisms and how they work when they move into people and produce human diseases.